fastest wrestling on the edge of the world!
Hello everyone and welcome to The Bleeding Edge, the podcast about wrestling on the edge of the world, SPW in New Zealand. Tyler King joined by David Dunn. David, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing great this week, Tyler, and boy oh boy, it's been a big week for New Zealand wrestling on a worldwide stage, hasn't it?
It certainly has. The last episode we talked to New Japan's Toa Henare. He was talking about how much big singles matches in New Japan mean, and he was able to get his big singles match, his first ever singles match main event, I believe, in New Japan as part of the New Japan Cup in the first round.
And not only Toa Henare, but he was up against a fellow Kiwi in Switchblade, Jay White. That's absolutely huge, and by my records, the first time in more than 60 years that two New Zealanders have main evented an international show like that.
So, yeah, who were the last ones 60 years ago?
As far as I can tell, we are talking about Abe Jacobs challenging Pat O'Connor for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship in February of 1961, the last time two Kiwis clashed in a main event like that.
Far out. Well, bringing it back to 2021, that was certainly an awesome main event to watch between Toa Henare and Jay White. But over in the United States, we've also got more history being made with Dakota Kai and NXT.
That's right, William Regal making the massive announcement. There is a new NXT Women's Tag Team Championship and awarding those championships to Raquel Gonzalez and our own Dakota Kai. How cool is that? We've had a Kiwi WWE champion.
Yeah, and the first ever. So that's in the record books forever. The first ever NXT Women's Tag Team Champion, Dakota Kai, along with Raquel Gonzalez. That is so cool. And of course, that can be seen on the WWE Network. But what else can be seen on the WWE Network is SPW alumni TK Cooper.
That's right, Tyler. Progress Wrestling Chapter 106. Available on the WWE Network now. TK Cooper taking on Gene Money. So log on in and check that one out.
Huge things happening in the world for New Zealand wrestlers this week, but bringing it back home to the Bleeding Edge, to the podcast. For this episode, our guest is SPW mainstay, the Alphalete, Charlie Roberts.
That's right, Tyler. Charlie Roberts and myself, we go back a long way. You know, I would probably credit Charlie Roberts as being the man who helped me get involved in professional wrestling as more than a fan. He started out his career on this side of the guardrail before he stepped in the ring as a reporter covering events around the Wellington region, and I went on to take over that role from him when he became a wrestler. So very, very influential in me doing what I do at the moment, and great to speak to him and hear his story of his lengthy career right here on The Bleeding Edge.
Here he is, the Alphalete, Charlie Roberts. Welcome to The Bleeding Edge.
Thanks for having me. It's your pleasure to have me, I'm sure.
Starting out as we mean to go on. How good. Charlie, you started out as one of us back in the day. You were a journalist. What do you remember about your first taste of getting into pro wrestling as a reporter covering events around the Wellington scene?
Oh, look, I remember the first show going to and just sitting there going, this is exactly what I thought New Zealand wrestling would be if someone said they do wrestling in New Zealand. And I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment, as backwards as that sounds. You know, it was a real different time back then where you had guys in tracksuit pants and singlets and, you know, guys pretending to be The Rock, and it was an interesting experience, those first couple of shows. But, you know, at the same time it was entertaining enough, and it wasn't something that you sort of took too seriously. But I think, you know, you could tell at the time that the guys in the ring probably didn't take it too seriously as well. So that's obviously changed a huge amount in the last 10, 15 years, which is really cool. And it's exactly what needed to happen.
You were obviously someone who decided to take it seriously too, and made the transition from attending these events on one side of the guardrail, decided you were going to start training and get in the ring yourself. But early on, as I remember, you sustained a knee injury that really could have been a career ender before you really even got your career underway. How did you push through that? How did you rehab it? And, what was the decision-making process where you thought, this is all going to be worth it, I've got to continue on?
So I was smart enough, I suppose, to blow my kneecap out and tear my ACL. And so, you go to training one night, and the next thing you're lying on the floor for about 30 minutes waiting for an ambulance because your kneecap's blowing around the side of your leg. At the time that was bad enough. And then, being the classic young and dumb, thought I knew better than a physio and didn't listen to my rehab plan, and proceeded to blow and further tear my ACL another 3 times in 8 months, to the point that it was barely hanging on by a thread. And after the last time, went and saw a surgeon, and they said, yep, that's going to need to be fixed, and pretty quickly too. And the first surgeon I saw said, you can forget about running or doing any form of contact sport, which was pretty gutting to hear. So then got a second surgeon, and he said, look, you got a huge road if you actually want to do anything physical or anything even remotely explosive. So rugby, league, anything, let alone wrestling. So went out, saw him, had the surgery done, and I was reading right before I went in surgery, ironically enough, there was a book that was talking about Stampede Wrestling and just talking about the sacrifices that these guys made. And I remember thinking, if this is what they want, and this isn't how this is going to end for me, I'm not going to be one of these guys who just sort of goes in, starts around, and then at 50 is sitting there going, wrestling. Let me tell you about the time I tried that. So when I came back from that surgery, it was like something switched inside me, and I was on crutches for 8-9 weeks after it, basically rehabbing twice a day for 6 months. And then, so there was the physical barrier, which was fine, and that sort of spurned, I suppose, my love for the gym as well, and just really getting into it. So before that, you'd obviously go to the gym and you kind of knew what you were doing, but using that time to just be a sponge and soak up as much knowledge as I could on how to build a body, how to train, what to do. And at the time, Graham Hughes was just over, and so he was taking all these trainings in Wellington. And you've got this guy who's been wrestling full time as his career, and teaching people all the stuff that no one had ever had access to before. And just sitting there and just being a sponge under that learning tree, I think really helped. And then eventually got to a point about 12 months after that where I was like, I want to see how this goes. And then you realize that there's this wonderful thing called a mental barrier that comes up. And that was pretty hard to overcome. Just the thought of, if I do this movement, it's going to blow out again, and then I'm back to square one. So, it took probably a good 2 to 3 years to really get confident with it and really sort of start trusting everything that, you can do this and it's not going to blow out. If you keep strengthening everything around it, it's going to be stable, it's going to hold on. And, I remember going back and catching up with my surgeon a few years back, and I haven't had any issues since. That knee's probably stronger, and I think I gained a hell of a lot more from it than just a new ACL or repaired knee. It actually became a major decision point, I suppose, in my life around, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to commit to this. And that's where my drive and my stubbornness really sort of comes from, really.
It's inspiring stuff. It's a great story to hear now that we're several years on and we see it panned out for the best. Exceptional stuff. When I first started attending wrestling events in Wellington, I remember seeing you as a referee, and then later on, I'd see you at ringside on KPW Off the Ropes as a manager. So does doing these roles outside of being in the ring, being a wrestler, does it give you a better grounding, a better overall understanding of the industry, of the business, to do refereeing, to do managing, to do all these supplementary roles? Or earlier on, did you just see that as a distraction from your ultimate goal of getting in the ring and wrestling?
Certainly it became a distraction over time, but I think there's a real fine line, and probably at the time I didn't appreciate it anywhere near as much as what I should have. But it's an education piece, to be a referee and be in the ring with guys. You sort of start picking up on how they move, how stuff looks, what it should look like, what it shouldn't look like. And when you're in there with really, really good guys, you can see the little nuances that they're doing, and that I think helped me, whether I realized it or not at the time, hugely. And then, so the manager shift actually came from obviously blowing out my knee and needing the surgery and having to be out for 2 years as it was. Again, you're at ringside, you're picking up on things, you're learning how to get a reaction from a crowd. And, genuinely at the time, I was probably like every person who starts wrestling and going, oh, I want to get in the ring, I can do this, I can just wrestle, I can do this, I can do this. And not realizing the level of education I'm getting. And that, I think, is immeasurable. It's like when anyone gets into wrestling and straight away they all sit there, and we've all done it. We've all had dreams of, I'm going to get in and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And then you realize to really be good at wrestling and to be a wrestler, it's the work you do around that. It's how many trainings you go to, how much tape you study. Are you there helping set up the ring and learning as much about the business as possible? Are you getting yourself to a point where people actually want to pay money to see you wrestle, or are you just doing it to jump around in front of your mates? And I think the more aspects of the business that you can learn, the more humbled, I think, is probably the word for it. And you just build this knowledge. And I was lucky enough to pick the brains of some really, really smart people who'd done it before me and just had these little touches, and you just pick up on everything. Which, again, at the time, I freely admit I didn't appreciate. I was just like, I want to wrestle, and that's what I want to do. And it took, again, it's that ego check, right? Of going, what do I need to do to actually get noticed? And then that's where you start putting together the stuff that no one else has done. Because not everyone's been a ref, not everyone's been a manager. And I'm not saying that's the path everyone needs to go down, but the more you can learn about wrestling, both in front and behind the camera, and learning about, if you've done any form of combat sport, it's not, you don't just get given the title fight. You've got to earn it. You've got to prove it. And I think that mentality for me now is so ingrained, whereas probably at the time it just wasn't. And I was like most people and just going, nah, just let me wrestle.
You mentioned you could tell when you're in there with some really good guys and you learned a lot. Can you give us some of the names that you learned a lot from and that inspired you a lot early on?
One of the guys that we had in KPW in the day was a guy called Irishman Mike Ryan, and he used to wrestle in the on the mat days. One of probably the most intimidating guys that you'd ever meet, just standing opposite him, but then one of the nicest human beings outside of the ring. And he would just take the time and talk to you about all these little things that guys just didn't do. So as a heel, how to really get people to hate you, and just the little psychology tricks that he would use, and the things of lay your stuff in and how to do it safely, and making sure that you're working for the fans first, which was a big thing. Lucky enough to have Steve Rickard turn up to a couple of trainings and just be able to pick the brains of, because these are the guys who brought wrestling to the mainstream in New Zealand and in the 80s, and up till SPW was able to do it, was still the only time it was in the mainstream, and that's something massive. I think that not a lot of people had or were lucky enough to have in training, and then as well having people like the Graham Hugheses come over from the UK, so you're picking up this UK style. And I just made a point of going to as many seminars as possible with different guys as well, and you just pick up all these different things from different things, and you might never not use them, but it's making that sacrifice and that ability to just learn as much as you can, because the one thing in wrestling that you do learn pretty quick is you never stop learning. And if you think you've reached a point where no one can teach you anything, or I'm better than everyone or I'm not going to learn anything, then you're probably at a point where you should look at stepping away, because that's not the attitude. And there's so much in this game that you just don't know.
Absolutely, always learning. And we know that you were a part of the first ever SPW event, and probably the first events for many other wrestling companies around New Zealand, many of which that may not have lasted the test of time. As we know, SPW going strong after 5+ years. And I remember talking to you in 2015, did a little video interview with you, and you said that when you were at that first show, it felt like this is what New Zealand wrestling should be. Can you expand on what you meant by that and what you remember feeling about SPW and what it meant to New Zealand wrestling when it started up in 2015?
Yeah, so I mean, I've lost count probably over the years of the first shows I've done for different companies who, are gonna change the scene. They're gonna do this, and they're no longer here. So it's a claim I'd heard, but again, knowing Mark, knowing Troy, both of these guys are exactly what I talked about before, right? They're always learning. They're always trying to better themselves. They put the time in to do it. And, that first show, I still just remember there being this energy down there. They're loud. They've never seen wrestling before. And, when it comes down to it, you sort of walk back from that and you're like, there is something here. Whether it's the town, it's the fans, it's the match Mark and Troy had, whether it's the match I had with James, it's all these factors that everything was different. I remember saying to Mark after the show as well that, hey, look, you've got something here, and you just need to run with it. It wasn't like a first starter show where you've kind of got half the stuff, so you just run with that and think that's all right. It was, they had everything thought of. They had lighting, they had filming, they had the entranceway, they had everything done to make this look like a big deal. And I think that night's still one of my favorite nights, just for the whole vibe and the buzz around that show.
Moving on from there in SPW, you're a part of the tag team Privileged with Curtis Castlewood. Tell us a bit about that run.
Yeah, so I mean, Privileged became bigger than what it sort of had any right to, I think. Obviously Curtis he started training in Wellington back in the day, and then when he moved to Auckland, kept up with his training, and then saw he'd been working hard and thought that we had a natural fit together from our personalities. Then as we started tagging, we started to realize that we had this chemistry, and this works. And I love tag wrestling. I absolutely love it and love being a part of tag teams. And again, it's one of those parts of, like I said before, the more you can learn about the different aspects, and tag psychology is so much different to regular wrestling psychology. And that tag matches were what I grew up watching and really enjoying. So guys like the Brainbusters and the Heart Foundation and Harlem Heat, all these tag teams where you're like, man, this is really cool. So I'd always wanted to do a tag team. And like I say, with Curtis, we had a natural fit. And we'd been tagging in Auckland for a few months at that point and starting to get some traction. And then that was when we got the call to come down to SPW. And I think the first match we had down here was actually a double header weekend, so Invercargill and then Queenstown, and that was against the Deadly Sins both nights. And I think the first night was their first match. And so again, right, it's one of those things where you sit there and go, cool, they're building a tag division. They understand that you can't just have singles matches. It's that old theory that wrestling's like a circus, and you've got to have something for each person that's in the crowd. Of someone's going to like the weightlifter, someone's going to like the lion, someone's going to like the magician, someone's going to like the clowns. Which I don't know who does that, but no one should like clowns. Being able to work with guys like the Deadly Sins straight off the bat, do the rumbles and all of that. It was just, again, it's one of those things that you just go, man, these guys get it. But that first match with the Sins, I do remember that we had that was the first time that they had the new ring, which was a lot higher than what the ring is now. And I remember talking with the Sins about doing a dive, and you're sort of sitting there looking at it going, that ring's way too high, and I'm standing here and I'm this short with my hands up, I'm not going to get you. And so you look at that and you're like, all right. But then again, you go into that match with the Sins and you come out of it, and it's, to make myself sound like one of those grizzled old timers now, is when you've been in wrestling new guys for a while, you start to get a feel pretty quickly for who's got potential, who doesn't. And after that match, you sort of come out of it and it's like, man, both of these guys have the potential to take on the world. And then we did it again the next night, and it was the same thing, the exact same energy. And Queenstown's always a raucous crowd anyway. Queenstown's unlike anywhere else. But you go out there with guys like that, and to be able to put on the matches that we did, I think were just fantastic.
Yeah, man. And that, you're right. The ring for that weekend was so tall. Like, if anyone's listening and you've got SPW on demand, go back and have a look at Southern Rumble 2016. The ring apron is like up to most of the wrestlers' chests, right? It was crazy.
Yeah, I still stand by the fact that was a rib. That, hey, here's this big match where everyone's got to be thrown over the top rope. By the way, here's a ring that's 6 foot high.
You touched on this a moment ago, so if we can circle back to it, oftentimes you do find yourself working with up-and-coming wrestlers of sorts in SPW, where you are, the quote-unquote old-timer, the man with the experience advantage. Is that a role that you relish, and having that trust put in you to be the one in there to make sure that everything goes as it should when you're in there with these guys who have had perhaps less experience?
I don't think anyone relishes being called an old timer. That's certainly not something I relish. But no, look, I think it shows a huge degree of trust. And again, I've always treated getting on cards as without wanting to make it sound like a pun, but as a privilege, not a right. There's so much talent coming up through New Zealand now that no one's bigger. No, not one person in New Zealand is bigger than the business, and that's something that probably quite a few people need to remember. Is when you have that shot, it could be your last shot. Everyone's one bad match away or one thing away from not being welcome back. And I think particularly when you've got a young guy, everyone remembers what their first match was like, and if you can give someone a better first match than you had, that should be your goal. But it's a huge degree of trust, and it's like when you're working someone new for the first time, is you don't know them, they don't know you, and you're going, cool, I've got to guide you through this. And that's a huge degree of trust from that person, but also from the promoter, to sort of make sure that, hey, look, you know what you're doing. At least one of you should, right?
So, as a man who has wrestled all over the country, from Auckland to Invercargill, everywhere in between, what are some of the major differences you've noticed in different pockets of wrestling around New Zealand, and why do you think it is that that SPW has taken off down here in Otago in Southland?
I mean, it's different every town. You go somewhere like Dargaville, and what you need to do up there is completely different to what you do in Auckland. I think the crowds are just different, and it's a demographic thing. Again, the fan that you attract in Auckland is going to be very different to the fan you attract down south. And I don't want to start a North Island, South Island war here, but people from the South Island are built very different to people in the North Island. And I think Invercargill for me just reminds me a lot of Wellington, in terms of the people down there get so passionate about things that are done down there. And so they want to have that wraparound support. And when they've got something there, they're going to embrace it. And when it's locally produced, that's even bigger. And I think that's part of what makes SPW unique, is Invercargill, and I suppose that whole Southland region has really embraced SPW as its own. And that's something where someone's gone out and said, actually, I'm going to give Invercargill something on a regular basis that they can get behind, and it's huge. And then you you take that model and you go over to Queenstown, which is a whole other beast in itself. I mean, you could do a whole podcast talking about Queenstown and wrestling, but I think probably that's the unique part of SPW is that, you know, it's something for Southlanders, by Southlanders, and something that they're proud of and fiercely proud of at that. So, you know, you go down there and it's SPW's talked about in the street type thing, which you'd struggle to find probably in any other city in the country.
And it ended up, of course, we've talked about it quite a lot on this podcast. It ended up getting to a point where we had an SPW event in ILT Stadium in Invercargill. Did you ever think that not only would New Zealand wrestling be on that stage, but in Invercargill of all places, you would be wrestling in a stadium?
Nah, never. But, you know, again, like you pull it back and you start looking at it, and after a couple of years of SPW, you could almost feel that momentum building, and you could feel that something was gonna break, and it was either going to be the go big or go home moment. And I think it's testament to what SPW's built, that when you go big and you do it well. And just, I remember walking into that stadium the night before and going, how nuts is this? That this is New Zealand wrestling. Like, this is New Zealand wrestling. This is where it can get to. And I think, you know, then to be able to parlay that into something that's shown on, you know, your major TV networks over here as a 100% homegrown product, that's surreal. But it shows that the appetite is out there for New Zealand wrestling, and there's people out there that do want to see this, and you can reach such a much bigger audience. And it's sort of knocking at the door, I suppose, because there's been a few instances over the years where I suppose New Zealand wrestling, and the best way to describe it, has sort of, after being buried in the 80s, has sort of managed to get a hand out of the grave, and then it's had more dirt piled on, but now it's sort of like it's actually pulling itself out, and you can just feel at the moment there's this real buzz around wrestling, and we just need to sort of keep pushing on that.
And speaking of another the big event that happened in New Zealand that you were a part of, I want to talk a bit about the Sakura events on the mat that happened back in 2016, I think it was, in Auckland.
Mm-hmm.
You were a part of this crazy card that had all sorts of wrestlers from New Japan. I mean, you had Kenny Omega and Kazuchika Okada in the main event, for goodness sake. Some of the best wrestlers in the world. Marcus Cole was also there. Tell us about your experience on that show.
That show to me was vindication. You know, that's a night that still lives with me, and that shit, you know, you can do it. You know, ever since I started in wrestling, it was the guy who was too small, and then you put on size, and then it becomes, yeah, but he just doesn't get it. His stuff isn't good enough, and you know, for years you're always told, you're not going to get that spot. We can't do that. Your spot is here. And you know, it's always blown my mind, I suppose, to come back to what I was talking about earlier, is that you get guys who go, I'll put the work in when there's an opportunity on the way. And my mindset is, and has always been, that you need to be ready for those opportunities, because this is a perfect example where I had less than 24 hours notice that I was going to be on that card. And that's still one of the most terrifying, panicked nights I think I've ever had, and one of the nights where I've slept the least amount before a show.
What was there, an injury or something?
Yes, there were a couple of guys who couldn't make it into the country due to flight troubles. So, you know, then you're sitting there and you're going the night before, can you come down? And they want to take a look at you. And then, you know, what a lot of people don't know is I had to do something with Kingy there in an empty arena the night before, and that's a lot of pressure, because Kingy is hands down one of the best wrestlers that New Zealand's ever had. And so in my head, I'm going, cool, well, you know, I'm not going to get the spot. And then when I found out I got that spot, it was like, now everything's changed. So, you know, I think I left the arena that night at about 9:30, and then had to be back there 10 a.m. the next day. So, it wasn't like I had long to think about it, which is probably for the best. And then I remember sitting there and, you see Marcus Cool and you walk in and automatically you feel relaxed. And you're just sitting there talking to him about how surreal this is and how nuts this is, that here we are. And then I think, the fact that no one knew that I was on that card, and then obviously answering that open challenge and hearing that reaction, and just, it's the footage that you can still find online of that, I think, is still one of the loudest reactions on that show. And it's a genuine reaction, I think. Because, look, there's people there that had no idea who I was, and that's fine. But I think knowing how many people were there who'd had my back from day one and supported me, and seeing that, there was a couple of moments there where you did have to take a moment as you're walking down to the ring to actually enjoy it. And I mean, yeah, you look at that, and again, you're sitting there going, I'm in a locker room which has the best wrestlers in the world at the moment. You had the Bucks, you had Okada, you had Goto, you had Omega, you had the Gorillas, you had King Haku, you had all these guys there, and you're just like, I'm in a locker room with these guys. I'm wrestling on the same show as these guys. You look back at that now and you can say that, but then, at the time it was also like, right, you're here to do a job, so go to work.
And you're also a big part of Impact Pro Wrestling in Auckland. What do you make of the current partnership between SPW and IPW? What do you think it could mean for both brands moving forward?
I think it's a great thing. I think it's something that has been a long time coming, and it makes a lot of sense. You've got, the best in Auckland teaming up with the best in the South Island, and I think the two brands work really well together. I think there's a lot of chance to keep growing New Zealand wrestling. Like I said right at the start of this, we've come so far from the days of chuck on your track pants and your singlet and come out to Disturbed or Metallica. You've got two companies that are really driving in the same direction, have a very shared vision on how wrestling in this country can be presented, what it can do, and you've got people at the helms of both who have these visions and aren't afraid to take the risk to get there. And I think that all bodes so well for the future. And you've got more opportunities for guys. The days of wrestling once a month are out the door, or wrestling 4 times a year. Those are long gone now, and you've got companies that are willing to give guys a platform to do this, and half of that's now on these guys to step up and grab these opportunities while they can.
You mentioned it a little bit earlier that we could do an entire podcast on Queenstown and wrestling in Queenstown. Obviously, we don't have the time for that right now, but if I can get you to just focus in and just condense it a little bit, we will see you next in SPW at Queenstown WrestleFest on April the 3rd. Many an amazing night had in Queenstown wrestling, many an amazing night had out in Queenstown after the wrestling. How excited are you to get back down to Queenstown this Easter weekend, April 3rd, for WrestleFest?
Look, I'm beyond excited for it. I think, as I said before, Queenstown's this own microcosm of craziness is the word for it. The crowd is always insane. There's such a buzz about those shows, and again, it's my chance to sit there and stake another claim as to why I deserve that SPW title shot. So I'm very excited.
We are very excited to see you back in action. Cannot wait for Queenstown WrestleFest. Charlie Roberts, as we start winding things down here, thank you very much for joining us on The Bleeding Edge this week. For people who have been listening, who want to stay up to date with you and everything that's coming up for you, both in Queenstown with SPW and all around the country, what's the best way for people to do that? Where can they find you on social media?
So on Facebook, it's Charlie Roberts Wrestler, and Twitter, Instagram, it's CRobPWNZ. They're where you can find me online, check out what I'm up to, stay up to date with everything. If you like gym selfies, then Instagram's the place for that.
I'm following you on all those channels. I love all that content. Charlie Roberts, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and join us this week. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Bleeding Edge.
Like I say, it was your guys' pleasure.
There you have it. David Dunn is a fan of the Alphalete gym selfies. Who wouldn't be, though?
He's got some great content out there on the Instagram. Give him a follow.
And of course, as mentioned, he will be appearing at Queenstown WrestleFest coming up on April 3rd. David, let's talk about it.
Let's do it. Tickets are available now from Event Finder if you're in New Zealand. If you are listening from further afield, don't worry. Of course, the full event will be available on SPW on demand. But Tyler, that's right. We know our main event. Hooligan versus Niwa, round 2.
Round 2, indeed. Can't wait. Man, you know, Hooligan Marcus Cool's main events in Queenstown, always epic. Hey, Charlie Roberts did say you could do a whole podcast about Queenstown. Maybe next time, why don't we get the Hooligan on the bleeding edge and talk all about Queenstown?
Sounds like an excellent idea to me, Tyler. If you guys want to see it, tweet the Hooligan. Let him know. Let's get him on the podcast. Let's talk everything Queenstown.
And announced this week, we've got a guest host for SPW Queenstown WrestleFest.
That's right, Tyler. We've got Gary Sansom. He's a Scottish comedian, but he's currently in New Zealand, and he will be taking over the MC duties for Queenstown WrestleFest. And this is very exciting. I mean, I don't know if you remember. Of course you remember. You were there. Everyone remembers. How good was Rhys Matthewson as the guest host for the SPW Southern Rumble at ILT Stadium?
Yeah, well, Rhys Matthewson was great, but he did enter himself in the Southern Rumble match, going a bit above and beyond his duties as guest host for the evening. But and he gave Professor Palmer a run for his money in the record of fastest elimination. But yeah, Queenstown, I think, will be the perfect environment. And, will be great to see what Gary brings. I'm sure you'll get to share the ring. Maybe he'll be able to get you to do a rap.
I'm not so sure about that, but I'll start doing some practicing just in case.
Hey, if you want to see David Dunn do a rap at Queenstown WrestleFest, get the hashtag going. Spread the word, you know. Come on, Bleeding Edge listeners.
I'm sure there are better causes we could rally behind, but if this is what we wind up doing, then let's go for it. Hooligan and Niwa, round 2, David Dunn doing a rap. What more could you ask for from a pro wrestling event?
I think we need to get a graphic made for this rap. Sounds like it's official.
Do it just before doors open, I think.
Yeah. So make sure you join us back here next time. We are going to get the Hooligan Marcus Cool on the podcast to talk all things Queenstown WrestleFest and to talk all things SPW. If you have any questions you'd like the Hooligan to answer, let us know.
Get those questions in, hashtag SPWNZ for the Hooligan. Make sure you're following us on the social media as well at SP Wrestling NZ on Twitter and Instagram for all of these updates coming your way for Queenstown WrestleFest. That does it for this episode, but we will see you again in 2 weeks' time for our chat with the Hooligan, Marcus Cool. Goodbye from the Bleeding Edge.